Good evening and welcome to Poems On. I'm Al Basile, and this is the third show of the third season. And we have two returning guests for this show whose theme is Christmas, New Year's, solstice, end of year activities of any kind and all kinds. And my guests are Julie Kane and Angela Alaimo O'Donnell. Wonderful returning guests from memorable earlier shows. I certainly remember them fondly. So why don't we get underway immediately, Julie, and you can give us your first offering here, please.
Okay, I think I'm going to start with one called Ghosts of Christmas Past, and it's just a series of 5 little haiku about memories from childhood Christmases. 1, somebody's bad idea, mixing Tide and water paste for snow on the tree. And let me tell you, it was like white glop all over that tree. It was horrible. 2, when the tree came down, we would eat the candy canes grown sticky and stale. 3, one lavender bulb on a multicolored string. We cried when it broke. 4, favorite ornament, bagel with a bite out. Mouse, real mice got to it. 5, shiny bright glass balls, my inheritance from Graham. Cat gets one each year.
Oh my. Well, you've got laws baked into your early memories of Christmas then, eh?
Absolutely. I love the nod to Dickens, of course. Christmas it's a very haunting time of year, isn't it? You know, like you can't not remember all of the Christmases that have come before. And even though it's supposed to be this very celebratory holiday, it's always tinged with this sadness.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, and the poems that we're going to read tonight are examples of that. I mean, these are not your Hallmark card sentiments.
Actually, those things all were happy then. You know, the little lavender bulb, you know, we loved, and the little bagel mouse ornament we loved, and you know, my grandmother's ornaments. But time does, you know, work. It's unmagic on things.
This is only one of the reasons why I don't have a cat.
Time and cats, right?
Wow. Well, yeah, I need to go think about my earliest memories, because that's the whole holiday season has been really transformed since my parents passed, because I'm an only child. So there isn't we had a very nuclear holiday scene when I was young that is completely irreplaceable at this point. And your list of memories makes me think that I don't think I've ever written about my memories of Christmas. I've done it for other holidays, so it gives me something to think about. Well, let's move to the first stage from Angela and see where she's going to take things.
Sure. Well, I thought I would go in chronological order. So rather than starting with Christmas, I would start with the pagan holiday that precedes Christmas, the winter solstice.
Yes.
Which is, like, for whatever reason, one of my favorite days of the year. It's the darkest day, of course, of the year. We have the least dark, the least sunlight, and maybe it's because of the sense of, like, okay, after this, we get through this, you know, we begin to see the light that's coming. But there's also something about, you know, glorying in that darkness, you know, and letting that darkness, letting ourselves be present to it, that I've always found very attractive. So I've written a number of winter solstice poems, but the one I'm going to read is a villanelle. And it's in my book, Lover's Almanac. It's the last poem actually in the book. So it's foreshadowment, villanelle for the solstice. Here, here, in the crook of the year, the crux and fix and flux of the year, light falls long across and dear. Here in the ruck and dreck of the year, we glean and gather grace and gear. Here, here, in the crook of the year. Here is the neck bone of the year, its knuckle sharp, its blade sheer, where light falls long across and dear. Hear the matins of the year, the chant of praise and marrow fear. Here, here, in the crook of the year. Cheer the vespers of the year, the prayers that rise from tongue to ear as light falls long across and dear. Clear your mind as night draws near, stead your heart and shed no tear. Here, here, in the crook of the year, where light falls long across and dear.
Oh, thank you. You know how much I love musical devices. And that's why I was looking forward to hearing you read this. I think it's very much an effective herd, a herd poem as well. I mean, you can read it on the page, but this really brings it alive for me. I had a question about the word stead. Is that from the same root as steady, as in steady your heart?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's funny. I inferred that, but I don't think I've ever come across it before.
Oh, really? Just used as a verb? Stead your.
Yeah, just that word, just S-T-E-A-D. I don't think I'd ever seen it.
Oh, yeah. Steadfast, of course, that's another word that we use in connection with stead, right? Yeah. I actually would love to Google it right now to get the most basic meaning of it. But yeah, steady, steadfast, stead. It's all related. Yeah. Thanks for asking about that.
Well, it's a good word. I may have to use it. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Julie.
I think John Frederick Nims, in his chapter on sound in poetry, talks about how words that begin with st often mean kind of sturdy, strong, steady. There's this, something about the st sound and that sense of, just standing firm, seems to go together. It's
that's lovely. I love Nims, by the way, and he's just come up recently. His poem, Love Poem, which I used to teach all the time, and it's a wonderful, wonderful poem. He's such a great sonic poet, as well as a great translator, and not somebody who people pay enough attention to. So thank you. It's evidently of Germanic origin. It's related to the Dutch word stad, which means town, and the German Stadt, which means place. And it's also from an Indo-European root shared by the verb stand, so stand instead.
Yeah,
that must be the basis of the stand instead. Yeah.
Well, and that's only one example of an effective use of sound in the poem. And because you're in the villanelle form, which has got all of that natural repetition built in, it lends itself to this kind of musical chant, almost a chant, where you're returning, you're covering the same ground, but with variations over and over and over and over again. And so it is incantatory. And that's something that I really love about it. And it's the kind of poetry that I really like the most, when on top of all of the other things that you're getting into the words, if you were to hear it read aloud on the other side of a wall, it would still have an impact on you, even though you couldn't make out what the words were. If that makes sense to you.
Yeah, it's weird. When I was writing the poem, working on it, as it emerged, it felt like almost like a spell. That is
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
A spell against the darkness, like
Yeah,
you have to endure the darkness, but somehow, and there's some sort of magical quality. As we all know, people they flock to places like Stonehenge, to watch the lights, watch the sun come up, all of the mystical, magical things that are supposedly happening in those Neolithic graveyards. Like there's something magical about this time of year. And it seems like a poem should somehow capture that in its form as well as in its
yeah. I mean, it's very, very much locked into the history and the kind of symbolic power of the solstice, which is almost pre-religious. So it's I like it. I'm glad you read it. I wish I had something that drew on some of the same techniques, but I don't. But I'm going to read from my first one something that is kind of an exercise in imagination. It's called An Infancy, and I wrote it on Christmas 2 years ago. And it's my imagining of the awareness of the newly born infant in the context of his mission in, coming into the world in the incarnation. So An Infancy, Christmas 2021. At first, he'd felt his mother all around him, but now her warmth was next to him outside, where everything except for her was cold. It stung his cheeks and stabbed beneath his covers. He drew a sudden breath. It chilled a place inside him. When he pushed it out, he found he made a sound, a way of stabbing back. This outside didn't try to meet his needs. Those who made much of him hadn't stayed. They looked on him with what they would call wonder. He would come to see the look again. But now the other faces were indifferent, except for these two who have carried him. Outside of him, his mother had a face, smooth and shining, and when she came near, she made the air around him warm and sweet. She smelled of what he'd learned was cinnamon and cloves. Once his mouth was brought up to her breast, he found that he could taste what he took in, and that it filled a different place inside. She held him, lifted him, and gave him to the other one whose arms were broad, whose hands were rough and strong and smelled like cedar boards and shavings, as he'd find in time. Although the other one would feel so strange, no name seemed right. The later taunts of who he was and who he wasn't made no wound, for he'd done everything a father did. They were his protection from the world's neglect, its careless tendency to harm, until he had the strength to venture out and share with it what made him who he was. All had been around him from the start, the wonder and indifference, warmth and cold he had received, and what he had to give, love from the inside, shining out again.
Oh, I love how you use language to convey the experiences and sensations that come before language, that the pre-linguistic experiences of the infant. It's incredible. It's, you really got inside inside that baby's consciousness.
Well, thank you. No, go ahead, please.
Oh, of course. And then the end is, something altogether different. The end, foretells the future that's to come. But yeah, the whole beginning part is really my favorite part of it.
It's really just such a wonderful take on this scenario, because most people, when they write poems or they depict this moment, this scene, take it from Mary's perspective, right? From the mother's perspective. It's
Yes.
very unusual to take the baby's perspective.
Right.
Partly because of the problem Julie just mentioned, like what does a baby think about? What does a baby see? And I love how sensual it is. My favorite lines are, once his mouth was brought up to her breast, he found that he could taste what he took in and that it filled a different place inside. What a wonderful line for, and as we know, babies babies don't eat in the womb. They just get fed sort of intravenously from the amniotic fluid. And then all of a sudden it's like,
Yeah.
oh, food, oh, taste. Oh, it's
Yes.
happening. So it's
Yeah.
a wonderful, very sensual description of what it must be like to get your first taste of food. And this is, of course, the baby, but it's also a baby. It's an infancy, not the infancy, but an. So yeah, it's lovely.
Yeah, well, thank you. And as you say, it's not a point of view that you see explored very often. And so on the one hand, it's kind of a challenge, but on the other hand, nobody really knows whether you're getting it right or not. Because none of us can remember what we were thinking or pre-language or what it was like. So I just kind of put myself in the place of this creature that's just beginning. What would be the first distinctions that you'd be able to make consciously? Mm-hmm. And it seemed to me inside outside that's what it's about. When you're newborn, all of a sudden everything has been turned upside down in your world. And you'll never experience being inside, completely nurtured by your mother again. So this is pretty new. As I say, I wrote at Christmas 2 years ago, and I don't have children, and I'm certainly not a mother. I'd like to see a woman do the same thing, because a mother's perspective would certainly be different and almost certainly deeper than what I can bring to it. But it was something that I hadn't seen done. So I thought, well, okay, I'll do it.
Yeah.
There's a lovely poem by Mary Karr in her book, Sinner's Welcome, which is called Dissenting Theology, the Nativity. And it does just that. It's seen from the perspective of the mother, and in which Mary is just like she bore no more than other women bore. It begins really with this basic account of pain and childbirth, especially in, and so, and it does a lot of what your poem does, only from the mother's perspective rather than from the baby's perspective. So I think of these as sort of, they're like a diptych, these two poems. So
interesting. Well, I'm writing down Mary Karr. What's the name of the poem? Do you remember?
The name of the poem is Dissenting Theology, the Nativity.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Great.
I'll be happy.
I love that you focus on smell and touch and taste too, which is, almost like what any baby animal, would be experiencing, and not sight. When you see things, you have to sort of focus on them and recognize what they are, to see, but you don't need that kind of, advanced consciousness to, to feel and smell and
yeah, the part that I missed out on was the sound, because I certainly could have extended it to the closeness of the heartbeat and the difference in perspective. What is a mother's heartbeat like for an embryo, for a child in the womb? I wonder, but I know that after you're born and the mother holds you close to her heart, that hearts tend to synchronize.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of a missed opportunity. I could have added something to the poem, but thanks for
another poem.
Yeah, I guess I probably shouldn't press my luck.
I often tell my students when we're talking about rhythm and meter and rhyme and how important they are, that because we are our very first sound that we hear is our mother's heartbeat, and we hear it constantly for 9 months, and then we get born, and it's terrible for lots of reasons. There's reasons that we scream when we're born, many of
Yeah.
them. But one of them is that all of a sudden, like the absence of that rhythm that we've known our whole lives, and we spend the rest of our lives looking for it.
Yeah.
And even though we're rhythmic creatures, we have our own heartbeat, we have our own blood circulating, we have systolic and diastolic blood pressure, everything else. It's not the same as that constant rhythm that we had. So, and that's why we love the ocean. That's why we love any dance, music, and
Yeah.
poetry.
Yeah. And it's why those of us that use meter are drawn to meter, because it seems so far from being something artificially imposed, it's always felt to me more natural than non-metric language. And that, I mean, you've really touched on why that is. So good. We're not the outliers that some people want to make us out to be. Well, this is great. Once around the circle brings us back to you, Julie.
Back to me. Okay. Angela read a villanelle, so I could read a villanelle too. This one was set during the famine in Ireland, and it's actually it's a real story about my third great grandparents. On Christmas Eve in 1846, there was a newspaper item about them that I found when I was doing research. But my third great grandfather he had been able to get work on a road crew. And back then, whenever people were starving and, dying, just, by the thousands, to get those coveted road crew, jobs was really a big deal. But he still had his house. And apparently the other men on the road crew, who'd lost everything, were really envious of him. And this is what happened. Arson in Knockmulon, 24 December 1846, Patrick and Mary Horgan Lynch. Who'd burn a family's house down Christmas Eve, the first year of the famine? Men he knew who shoveled dirt beside him, men who heaved great stones to lay the roadways, men aggrieved he'd given up his land to join their crew, the men who burned his house down Christmas Eve. Because he had a roof of sod and sheaves of straw, while they lay down in ditch or pew, they slunk up with a flaming torch and heaved. 6 children slumbering, their mother's sleeves caught fire as she pulled out the youngest, 2 weeks old and newly christened, Christmas Eve. That night, the county jail was full of thieves who'd stolen so they'd get a cell and soup. The workhouse doors were bolted. How to heave a baby in burned arms? Did they believe in God and bless the dark that hid the view of corpses in the road that Christmas Eve, dead mouths stained green from eating grass and leaves? It's yeah.
So strong.
Powerful poem. Absolutely. And history, true. It's so haunting.
Well, it bears out. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that image of the mouth stained green from eating grass came from history book about the famine. Like, oh my God,
Yeah.
Yep. I feel like I'm being reminded of other poems constantly here tonight, but this reminds me of Yvonne Boland's poem Quarantine, which is also about a family tragedy in the midst of the famine. A husband and wife who are lost on one of the famine roads one night. And of course, this is not due to natural causes. This is evil. This is somebody setting someone's house on fire, but still that backdrop of just death haunting everyone, and the circumstances in which people are living, and then to put on top of that this cruelty and destruction for no reason. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and
And
also put
especially,
in, please, go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say, especially that it happened Christmas Eve, of all
Yes.
days, of all
Yeah,
days,
that's
in a very
exactly,
religious country,
yeah, that's what I was going to say too. But, it points out for me, studies that were done of tribes, African tribes in extreme deprivation, where even within families, people turned on each other, and
Uh,
any veneer of care for anybody else just evaporated. And
uh,
it reminds me that when the deprivation is great enough, we resort to a kind of an animal instinct of survival at all costs. And yeah, that's almost exactly the opposite of the message of Christmas. Um, but it's,
although she burned her arms to save that baby who was my second great grandfather,
yeah, well, they haven't quite reached the level of the guys that torched the house,
Yeah.
but those guys had. And so, yeah, I think that I have known in my life people who, when confronted with stories like this, acknowledging that they're true stories and that they really happen, can't relate and say, I could never have done anything like that. And I've always thought that position was a fundamentally naive one, that
Yeah.
that we've all got this in us, and we've got to acknowledge that so that we can guard against it, because it is natural for us to be cruel, just as in another way it's natural for us to be caring. And so if all we do is rely on what comes naturally to us, we can be led into some very, very grim realities like this one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we were saying, this seems ironic because this happens right around Christmas and Christmas Eve, and it doesn't seem to be consonant with the spirit of the year. But actually, when we think about it, I mean, the whole reason that Christmas had to happen and that the incarnation had to happen is because of human sin, to use
Yes.
the
Right.
logical
Right.
right. Redemption comes, out of the darkness in the hope of saving us from ourselves, basically. I think it's interesting that, the day after Christmas, we celebrate, it's St. Stephen's Day, the death of the first martyr. And then the 28th, the massacre of the Holy Innocents by Herod, because Herod is moved to murder by the birth of the baby. So it's like Christmas is very fraught because it's, I mean, in a secular way, we tend to celebrate it as like a big celebration. But if you really look at the religious origins and the liturgical time that Christmas is set in, it's like there's a lot of grimness.
Yeah,
that's true. A lot of cruelty and turning the family away from inns too. Denying the warmth to that heavily pregnant woman, really inhuman cruelty.
Absolutely. And then Mary and Joseph have to get up in the middle of the night and then run to Egypt because
yes,
is being sought after. So we don't tend to do, in our culture of wanting to celebrate Christmas, we don't tend to do justice to the dark elements of the story.
Yeah, that's really true. And it's also good to keep in mind that the incarnation happens at a point in history, and it happens for a reason that is connected to all of history. But in all of the time since the incarnation, and 1848 was only one of the many examples, and there are more going on as we speak in the world right now, the kind of descent into sin kept on happening the day of the nativity and the day after and the day after that. And it's continued right down into the present day. And I think this is something that people who struggle with the concept of the message of the incarnation gets hung up on. It's like, well, if this was supposed to be such a great thing, why did nothing change? And of course, there's an answer to that, but but people, they see that we are still fundamentally sinful creatures. Of course, people don't believe in sin anymore, so they don't call it that, but they understand that deep in our nature, there are some, there are some twisted, grim imperatives that we give into if we don't have some kind of guidance. So that's kind of what I hear those arguments basically that's where they're grounded is, well, that really didn't make any difference because look. So.
Yeah, and also one of the things I appreciate about this poem, I think we were all three raised Catholic, right?
Yeah.
I'm Italian American Catholic. Al's Italian American Catholic. Joy's Irish Catholic.
Yeah.
So this is like very deeply, this was part of our formation, right? This understanding of, of the story, the Christian story, and we all know, those of us who were raised with this kind of formation, like the birth of Jesus was not the end of something; it was the beginning of something, and like
exactly
that leads to the crucifixion, and that's why any story that does not have about Christmas that does not have some element of darkness in it does not understand, because when Mary's pondering all these things in her heart, like the question that I always think of when I try to imagine, like what did she know exactly? Like most mothers, when they have a new baby, don't want to think about the fact that their baby is going to die. That's not that they're born to die, but obviously she has got a sense that something is going on here, something much bigger than she is, and that she is just going to have to kind of roll with the punches, and it's a very powerful, just such a powerful story because the incarnation starts with Jesus' birth, but it's not the end of it. So
yeah, and it's foreshadowed. I mean, really, the darkness in the middle of which the child is born into the world foreshadows the darkness of the crucifixion. That and that's why, in a little different way, and my last poem, I was talking about how everything was there at the nativity, all the elements were there at the nativity. People who cared about him, people who were indifferent, the cold, the harshness, the cold of coming into a world that was not welcoming, is of course it's all a part of the foreshadowing of the whole story. But you're exactly right, Angela. You really shouldn't take the nativity out of context. And that is exactly the direction that our culture has dragged it. When they even acknowledge that it's about the nativity and not about, Santa. So, but yeah, well, at any rate, Julie, thank you for illustrating my comment earlier about how this was not going to be greeting card sentiments. I wouldn't ever expect to see your poem on a greeting card.
Merry Christmas. Hope your house doesn't burn down.
Oh my.
By your neighbors.
But really, these are, I mean, what we have and what we're in the middle of unfolding is, I think, a very useful meditation on the end of the year, on Christmas as a holiday, on New Year's as a marking of a change in the affairs of humans, and the solstice as a marking of the change in the heavens. And so it's good that we're not all sleigh bells and sweetness and light. It's very appropriate what we're doing. So where are you going to take us next, Angela?
Well, as long as we're talking about darkness being associated with the nativity, we might as well just plunge right in. When I was a couple of years ago, it was right before the pandemic, I was able to make a trip to the Holy Land, and we did a pilgrimage to all of the holy sites in Palestine and in Israel. I'm so glad we went then, because a trip like that would be unimaginable right now, of course,
Yep.
what's going on in the Middle East. But it was interesting to me because having been raised Catholic and having heard about all of these storied places all of my life, actually experiencing them was very powerful. I really had this kind of sense of, the presence of the many, biblical characters that I had read about and heard about, So not only Jesus and Mary, but also the woman taken in adultery and the woman who gets the flow of blood healed by Christ. So I ended up writing this book, which is called Holy Land, which is about that experience of the Holy Land, but also other holy lands as well, including Ireland, that I have visited. So there's a series of poems. The first segment of the book is called Christ Sightings. And so these are a number of the places where I felt this presence of these storied human beings that had lived 2,000 years ago and left behind something of themselves. And one of those places, of course, was the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. I don't know if you've been to Bethlehem, but the church, it's amazing. The Church of the Nativity is right in the center of town, and it's right across from the big mosque in town. And so, like the connection of all of the religions, the three great Abrahamic religions, is so close in the Middle East. So when you go to the Church of the Nativity, you actually go into the basement of the church, way down underneath, and that's supposedly, tradition has it, where the baby Jesus was born. So this poem is called Christ Sighting, December the 25th, and the epigraph is at the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, and it is a sonnet. Here comes the dark, the dearth of the year, and here comes Christ again, born when he's least expected and most needed. Now and here, in the midst of famine, comes this feast fit for fools, surrounded by the ruin we have made of our own earth, the rivers black with mourning from the jewels they once were, the air thick with smoke from the charred trees. Now in the darkness, we fall to our knees in wonder at the baby birthed just for us. We deserve nothing, no small sign of luck. In a world ripped by rage, choked with anger, love lies sleeping in a dirty manger.
Oh.
I envy you having been there.
It was amazing, I have to say.
I'm sure it was.
Oh, I love that dirty manger too. The usual image is just so, airbrushed and pristine, but of course
glowing
animals.
It's always glowing.
Animals have been using it. Yes, it's real. I like it.
I actually offended inadvertently. I gave a sort of Advent retreat last year in which I read a number of these poems, and there were some people who were really bothered by that particular line because,
oh no,
they were so troubled by the idea that Jesus would be born into a manger, and of course he was.
yeah. But until you wrote it, I hadn't thought of that. You made me really understand that.
Yeah, it bears revisiting and rethinking, because we've settled into a kind of a rote way of describing the event and the experience, because we've seen one way of looking at it over and over and over and over and over again. So to come back and to essentially reinvent a new way of looking, at the nativity, particularly when you're lent the authority of what's supposed to be the actual context. It's you have a right to describe what you experience and connect it to that event, even though you're not describing the event in a comfortable, familiar way. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was also after, I mean, our world's been on fire for years now, so I'm not sure what particular set of fires it was that was happening. Like maybe it was when Australia was on fire right before the pandemic, but that sense in which, you know, the world has been a wreck for a really long time. It was the world that Christ was born into was a wreck. The world that, you know, in 2019 was a wreck. It's a wreck in a different way now. That's just, it's the world is terribly fallen and terribly broken. And that this sort of rebirth every year of hope, of possibility, you know, that Christmas brings us, right? That sense of hoping that it can be redeemed, that this broken, dirty, lost, seemingly lost world can be redeemed in some way. I mean, that's really what Christmas is for Christians, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But again, people struggle with the optics of it, that they're told this is an important transformational event, but it's in a manger. You know, I mean, all of these Renaissance artists that, you know, have the cow sticking his head through the, you know, through the window as though there was a window. We've had the whole experience prettied up for us, so that even the rudeness of the manger is given a kind of a, I don't know how you can whitewash a place where the animals are, but you know what I'm saying? It's minimized, the actual nature of it, when it should be just the opposite. That it's because the world is the way that it is, that the incarnation had to happen. And what better place for it to happen than where what's wrong with the world is on display. It does make sense.
Yeah.
So, well, I have a nice thank you for reading that one, Angela, because I have a fairly natural segue. Although the last poem I'm going to read comes back to the theme that you were just talking about in terms of the kind of apocalyptic natural imagery that you use. What I do in this poem, it's called A Christmas Wind, and this also was written on Christmas. This time it was written the previous Christmas of 2020, which was deep in COVID reality. And I think that emotionally we were all so jarred and dislocated by the onset of this reality that we'd never experienced before, that we were instantly in uncharted territories. And certainly there was a whole lot of depressed people on the face of the globe at the time. And of course, it was also, in the case of this poem, here's something happening on Christmas. And again, it's the bleakness of Christmas and the prospect of hope at Christmas that I'm trying to treat in the poem. So it's a Christmas wind. And basically it reminds us that we're in winter. A scouring wind bore down on Christmas Eve, along with it a penetrating rain. Tireless, they worked to scrub away the snow. By morning, we can see the earth again. All that the snow had hidden lies revealed. Sodden leaves and broken branches tell of how much seeming death inhabits winter, how complete the loss of all that fell. The earth and sky are mottled blacks and grays, the opposite of wished-for Christmas white. But it is fitting after such a year that merciless this scene assails our sight. Let this Christmas tell its story, bleak, of how the dead are everywhere we look. Better to see the evidence sketched in of nothing further written in the book. A mask of snow would only hide the truth, that though the drained out face of earth pretends an end to everything that's gone, from desolation life will spring again. Don't be fooled by surfaces. Be patient. Look earth in the eyes. Though shut, they wait. A winter's death is only preparation, and dark, no more than light, predominates. This year, the human darkness is oppressive. Nature is troubled, and we no less so. All seems lost, but spring will keep its promise. As above, so let it be below.
Mm. Can I ask what year again did you write that?
2020.
2020, yeah. Nature is troubled and us no less so, yeah.
Yeah, I'm always on the hopeful side of the scales. So that's why I come down on this. And the last line of the poem harks back to what Shakespeare was doing in a play like Macbeth, when the bad weather prefigures the killing of Duncan. You know, the night that Duncan dies, there's graves lie open, and there are great winds, and nature is, and there's this comment about how nature troubles man's sight, and there it's that the heavens reflect the disorder of man. And so this is the other side of that coin. This says, well, out of this disorder, spring will bring the order of new life. So as above, so let it be below with us, because humans were just thrown into an uproar that we're still digging our way out of.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're at the point where we're at the stage now where everybody wants to feel like we're over it. And so we put it away and are moving along as though we're over it. But I don't think we're over it. So we're living a kind of a split life where we're not acknowledging that we still bear the damage of the last few years within us. So anyway, just an attempt to throw a little hope into the kettle.
The kettle, that's from Macbeth too.
Yes, it is. And it forced its way into my sentences somehow. Okay, so great. Now let's move into round 3.
Uh-oh, that must be me.
It is.
Angela took us to the Middle East, and it's funny, I was looking at this poem, which is one of the very oldest poems I've written. When I wrote it, the Iranian hostage crisis was going on. That was like late 79 to 81. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking, the hostages on the evening news is a line in it, and how relevant that is today too. How, and again, the Mideast hostages on the evening news, how, as we're talking about cycles and things repeating in history, and it's just really, really got to me reading this over. But anyhow, this is a poem about being in love at Christmas time, but having to part in a kind of, desolate airport with a desolate airport bar, and it's called Airport Bar. Poor little sprig of mistletoe, there might as well be an axe above this bar. 20 men in nice suits alone at tables for 2, and us in love and wretched, bending the plastic straws into wedding rings we're bound to lose in the rush before my plane takes off. The hostages on the evening news seem lucky, stripped of their right to rise and go. Too soon, this town will shrink to a tangled strand of Christmas lights, then nothing, and time to think.
Yeah, that's in your first book, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's an old one.
You gave me a copy of that book, and I've lived with it. I've read it probably 7 or 8 times.
Oh my God, you're my ideal reader.
Well, this is not the book that you find in the used bookstore that with the inscription, the man that you thought you'd love forever, or would you give a poem about that, Julie, about finding your book in the bookstore, used bookstore?
Oh, yes.
Not this one, right?
that was actually, yeah. It wasn't that book. It was the one before that, actually. Right. It was a 2-woman kind of, a double chapbook, that I found the copy of. Yeah.
Wow. Well, we've talked about this. You actually have read this in a previous show, and we talked about this, but I am partial to works of art in general and songs and poems in particular that take us someplace else at the end. And this is an excellent example of that, because you've set the scene and the emotional, the wrenching emotional reality of the farewell with the details, and they're very, in cinematic terms, they're very small and close to the lens details. So what's the what are you doing with you're doing something with the straws? Is what is it?
Bending the little straws into rings. Yeah.
Right. So this is very tactile, and it's very close, and it's close to the lens, close to, to the speaker. And then, as though to emphasize the displacement, the imagery at the very end is of extreme distance, is of being in the plane looking down and seeing these strings of lights, every one of which represents a place where maybe there are people doing these things that we saw at the beginning. So again, I like to see things in cinematic terms. And so what we've done is gone from a close-up to a long shot. And that takes us, it takes us someplace before it lets us go. And so so in that sense, and Time to Think is a perfect ending, because it's not just the speaker, you, who is going to be able to think about everything that's just happened as she's carried away in a precipitous manner, but it also leaves us, the reader, by ourselves to think about the nature of parting. And now we have time to think. We've been set on this path. We started with you together, and now we're somewhere else. And we can kind of think about, because it is a universal theme, although it's expressed in this extremely individual and personal way. So yeah, that was something I like about I like the marshaling of a visual detail to undergo some kind of a transition, and you do that very naturally here, and maybe not with cold-blooded intent, but I don't know. You can tell me. Do you remember writing this?
I remember that time in my life writing it. Yeah. And by the way, I love that the reader gets time to think at the end. I had never thought of it that way, but that really illuminates that last line for me. Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's kind of an invitation. I take it as an invitation. It's like, well, okay, she's thinking. I have an idea what she's thinking about, but I have some things to think about. And now I have time to do it because the poem is done.
And now my poem is done. I have time to think.
Yeah, because I don't think while I'm reading the poem. I wait till I wait decently until it's finished.
Oh. The line about the hostages is really shocking. It comes kind of out of nowhere, you know, because it is what blows the poem open, I think. It reminds me of Nothing Gold Can Stay, where, you know, nature's first green is gold, it's hardest heat to hold, its early leaves a flower, but only so an hour, then leaf subsides to leaf, then Eden sank to grief. And it's like, oh,
yes.
Oh,
yeah.
Where did that come from, you know?
Where did that come from?
Line has that same effect on, you know, it's like, oh, we're at the bar, you know, with mistletoe, straws on our fingers, and then the hostages, like that big event.
Yeah.
The news, lucky, which is like such an outrageous thing to say, right? Stripped of their right to rise and go. So there's something about that that really kind of takes the poem onto another level, in terms of the speaker's sense of, you know, the degree to which she does not want to part, right, with the person that she's with, and even going so far as to compare herself unfavorably with the hostages. So
yeah, she's saying the hostages are better off in a way, which is, I mean, a beautifully self-involved take that we associate with youth, if you'll forgive my saying so. And say, oh, those hostages, they can't, you know, they can't even do this, but so they're better off. But again, in cinematic terms, both the hostage line and Angela, you're exactly right. What Frost does when he goes to Eden sinks to grief, those are jump cuts.
Jump cut, yeah.
You know, it's like you immediately jump to something else, a different perspective, a different shot of something else, and it's the juxtaposition that lends it. It jars, but lends it a kind of a power. And then I like that the comments about the hostages kind of shows the extreme emotional place that the speaker has been put. Because I think under normal circumstance, she probably wouldn't have the same attitude towards hostages.
Yeah, exactly. At that very moment, yeah, she's wishing that she were back.
So it's a way of showing us her, but the camera's pointed at the hostages. Yeah. So again, the techniques. And I've asked if you remembered what you were thinking when you wrote it, which this distance is not really a very fair question. But part of you was figuring all these things out, whether you were doing it consciously or not. So the point is they got done.
And I love the cinematic technique approach to the poem.
Yeah, and you can, I mean, I often write that way. I often consciously write that way. When I'm writing narrative poems, I'm essentially setting up scenes and then making transitions and cutting to other things. And I definitely, and I think in terms of long shot, close up, pans, cuts, jump cuts, in longer narrative poems where you've got a bigger canvas to work on, those are very helpful management techniques, getting small parts of the bigger thing to work together. It gives you a kind of a vocabulary of juxtaposition of things that I find very helpful, because occasionally I write these ridiculously long narrative. Now, I mean, I wrote a poem that was a rewrite of a novel that I wrote 45 years ago. And it's like 1,700 lines. So the novel was longer, but
what's Paradise Lost for comparison?
It's 50 times as long. I mean, mine is a drop in the bucket, but for me it was a lot. but that gave me a long stretch to work in, and every once in a while I will do that. And then you really have to manage individual scenes, transitions, etc., just as you would do. And movie techniques are the ones in terms of long story forms that I'm most familiar with, because I've seen way more movies than I've read a lot of novels, but I've seen more movies. But again, not a lot of laughs into your Christmas memories, Julie.
The ones I don't write poems about are very joyful and funny. But one of my students asked me that when I was actually teaching a high school class, why are your poems sad? And it's kind of like, well, when I'm really, enjoying my life, I don't sit down and write. I'm living. It's only when I really need to, I really need to make sense of things, or I need to process, experiences, that I have that compulsion to write about them.
What is that? Is it Keats or Wordsworth, the lines recollected in
emotion recollected in tranquility? Yeah.
Is that what it is? Yeah, right.
Wordsworth, yeah.
It is Wordsworth. So there is something to that. But it's also true that, particularly when you're working from out of your own life anecdotally, anytime that we go back and try to capture the reality of an earlier part of our lives, what you have to go through in order to do it gets you as close to reliving the experience as you can get. Right. So if you go back and write about a positive experience, that's actually a kind of a healing process that restores some of the joy of that moment to you. So whereas if you're going back to something that was difficult, it's the fact that there's a distance that's been imposed that allows you to digest the difficulties of the past, because you know that you've lived beyond them. You know what I mean? So in other words, you don't have to get dragged down into the mud of your worst memories to write about them.
But also writing about them is a healing process, making art from them, finding meaning in the experience, as in relation to, to life now,
So we tend to use, so then we tend to go back to those moments and process them, the ones that need healing. Right. It is something that's available to us. And I frequently talked about in other shows in this series about how I consider it a kind of a blessing that as creative people, as artists in general, and as poets in particular, we have a way of processing those moments in our lives that people who are not creative don't have. And we really can promote our own healing in a way that maybe other people have to go to external professional help in order to, to face some of the things that they've experienced. Whereas by nature, we go back, we use our own lives as, we keep revisiting over and over and over again, because we can, and then we can bring something sensible out of it that can't help but be therapeutic. So, as much of it is a bit of a cross to bear to be an artist, but there are some perks.
Yeah. So yes, all of the comments that you made, I think, are absolutely apropos in terms of the ability or the gift, really, that creative people have to deal with crisis and trauma, really, through poetry, through art. I love this essay by Gregory Orr called Poetry and Survival. It was published in American Poetry Review, I think, after 9/11. And I use it to teach poetry to my students because he talks about the three primordial orderings that we use in order to make sense of trauma. Basically story, symbol, and incantation, song.
Yeah.
And these three elements are in every poem. Sometimes one is more dominant than the other. But it's really just a wonderful way to see the way in which poetry does give us this ability to try to process and deal with and create narrative and that redeems whatever it is that we've experienced, has happened to us.
Yeah, it really ought to get better press.
Yeah, and
poetry should get better press.
Yeah, people who don't normally read poetry or care about poetry suddenly want it in their lives when they're dealing with, the death of a loved one or, a tragedy like September 11th. That's when suddenly, poetry becomes very important and meaningful to people, who don't really care about it.
Yeah, they have an instinctive understanding that this is an attempt at a deeper form of utterance.
Yeah.
That it's not just conversation over the dinner table, but it's an attempt to say something that's got gravitas and that sums things up about life in a way that most not normal conversations don't. And it's in moments like that when they feel a need for something that makes that claim for itself, whereas they are free to think they don't need it the rest of the time.
Yeah, and it's comforting even when it's dark, because it has meaning. Your life has meaning, your experience has meaning. It's not just random and chaotic.
All very true. Well, we're agreed we all should get more of the right kind of attention. We have something to offer. The poets have something to offer and need to be heard from. Where are we in the program?
Julie read last.
So you're on your third poem then,
Angela.
So. Please.
And I think I'm still a little bit out of sync, but that's okay as long as you can hear me.
It's fine, right? Yeah.
Okay, great. So I thought I might switch it up a little bit and follow up with what we've been saying, but also switch up the tone of the poems that I've been reading. I have a couple of Christmas poems that are not from my voice, but from the voice of a writer that I'm very fond of, Flannery O'Connor. In this book, Andalusian Hours, Poems from the Porch of Flannery O'Connor, there are 101 sonnets in which Flannery speaks to us. I wrote this book because I've written a number of books on O'Connor, and her voice has been in my head for a long time. I teach her stories and her novels. And so these poems gave me opportunity to kind of get her voice out of my head and onto the page. And also to try to understand her from the inside, because all of us who've read O'Connor know that she says the darndest things. And sometimes I will take epigraphs from her stories or from some of her essays or her letters and try to understand more deeply what it is that she's getting at. There's one particular story that she tells in one of her letters that I think is very dear. We've been talking about the classic manger scene, right? That always involves animals. And of course, one of those animals is usually the donkey. And so this story is about Flannery's donkey. And it's a quotation from it begins with an epigraph, a quotation from The Habit of Being. This letter was written December the 31st, 1963. She says, Ernest did the honors for the Burrows this Christmas pageant. He did very well in the Christian manger, in which there were also a cow, a pig, a Shetland pony, and some sheep. And he did all right at the Methodist dress rehearsal. But when the big moment came and the church full of Methodists, he wouldn't put his foot inside the door. So this is Flannery's donkey, and it is a sonnet. My mama's donkey would be a Catholic. In this house, there's no other way to be. Braying his rosary on his rote rounds, chawing his consecrated hay, standing steady beneath the baptizing rain. If ever there was a holy burrow, Ernest is it. The Methodists see only an ordinary donkey, dumb creature, four hooves on the ground, happy as a pig at a potluck to preside at their Protestant play. We should have known he would say no. Our Catholic ass just could not feign nor hide his scrupulous disdain.
Oh,
That's great.
yeah. That's just charming.
She, as we, yes, as we know, O'Connor was a very Catholic, she came from a very Catholic family, and she was very, very observant, and as was her mother. And so it's inevitable, of course, that all the animals were going to be Catholic too, in this little world of hothouse Catholicism that she lives in. So it was I laughed out loud when I read this letter, in which she said, he's not doing it for the Methodists. I wouldn't either, is the, is the implication, right? And her personality comes across very well, but also this sense in which, I love donkeys. I've been very interested in donkeys lately. I'm sure you all know the Robert Bresson film about
Oh, yeah.
Oazar Baltazar.
Oh, it's about Baltazar, yes.
Yes, and then there was a lovely film, Polish film that came out maybe a year or two ago called Io, which is the sound that the donkey makes. And in both of these films, the donkey is represented as being this very saintly creature. And they're long suffering. They put up with human beings and their silliness, and they perform so well for human beings. And I was reading about donkeys. I mean, if you wanted to point to one animal that really changed human beings and brought them to civilization, it's not really the horse. Before the horse, there was the donkey, who did all of this labor for us, and freed us from labor. So it is this creature that doesn't get the credit for what it is that it has done for us. So, reading this passage about this donkey that has his own theological ideas about, how he's supposed to behave in the Christmas play, I thought, yeah.
The phrase, go ahead. The phrase "consecrated hay," I thought was just delicious.
It kind of reminds me of a story my mother told me about how she apparently wanted to be a bridesmaid for a Protestant friend of hers, and the priest had said, no, you can't even set foot, and you can't take part in a Protestant ceremony. No,
really,
it's not allowed. She was born in the 1920s. It's I've done it a number of times for friends of other faiths, but apparently not back then. The other thing I was thinking of,
yeah, that was the old days, the pre-Vatican II days, right? And if you went into church, something bad could happen to you, lightning from heavens. So Ernest knows, like, I'm not going
exactly. Lightning would strike you. Also, I was just thinking, the poet Will Sternberg works at a donkey rescue. If you're Facebook friends with him, he posts a lot of great photos of these donkeys and tells you all about their personalities and everything. You should really friend him if you haven't.
Oh, absolutely. I will look for him. That's wonderful.
Well, you know that my grandparents were the immigrants. They came on my mother's side. They came from Sicily, and my maternal grandfather, was a shepherd in Sicily around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. And he had all kinds of stories about donkeys, but of course, because he had very little English, the Sicilian word for donkey is shikudedu. So he would tell me these stories about the shikudedu.
Oh, that's wonderful. I had no idea. I did not know. I'm Sicilian too, and I never heard that word before. That's wonderful.
Well, maybe you're from a different part of the island. That could be too. I mean, Sicilians don't only not get along with anybody else from the mainland, they don't get along with each other either.
No, definitely.
So that's funny. Well, yeah, that definitely changed the tone. So I'm going to take things even a little further in terms of the changing of tone, because I'm going to read this short poem of mine called The Coventry Carol, which is the title of one of the, I think it's Wessex. It's an English carol, and or an Irish carol. And the poem is about music and hearing different kinds of Christmas music. So I'll read you the poem, and then I've got the thing that I talk about in the poem queued up, and I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you'll be able to hear what I've just been describing. That's my story, and I'm going to stick to it. So this is the Coventry Carol. And this is simultaneously a Christmas-related poem and a solstice poem. The Coventry Carol. Driving on the solstice, tuning into public radio, I heard a voice, legitimately trained, a little thin, but earnest. The soprano's every choice sound in phrasing and interpretation. She made me think of high church, vestments, chimes, and incense wisping at a congregation, a proper lullaby for modern times. Once home, I craved the voice squad's plainer tones, saw the shadows walk as blank light dimmed, felt the dank chill in December's bones, and tasted pewter on the tankard rim. So the voice squad, as you'll see, is a group of 3 singers. And if I can get this together, here they are doing the Coventry Carol.
Luli lula, thou little tiny child, bye bye lule lule, thou little tiny child, bye bye lule lule. Oh sisters too, how may we do for to preserve this day, this poor youngling for whom we sing, bye bye lule lule, lule lula, thou little tiny child, bye bye lule lule, thou little tiny child, bye bye lule lule. Herod the king in his raging charge yet he hath this day his men of might in his own sight, all young children to slay. Luli lula, thou little tiny child, bye bye lule lule, thou little tiny child, bye bye lule lule. That woe is me, poor child, for thee, and ever morn and day, for thy parting neither say nor sing, bye bye lule lule, lule lula, thou little tiny child, bye bye lule lule, thou little tiny child, bye bye lule lule.
Lovely.
Yeah, beautiful.
So you understand now the imagery at the end of the poem about how different this kind of music is from the high church. You know, I was an altar boy. I served a lot of high masses, and you know, there was music. And I came up in the Latin mass era, and it's just a different approach to music. And but these guys, then one of them has since passed, maybe two of them, but they were in their heyday in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and they're wonderful. And I say that they have plainer tones, you know, from the incense and vestments kind of voice that I had heard on the radio. So I took this as an antidote.
Yep. I love, well, as you say, a poem takes us on a journey, and I love the way that you take us on the journey from driving on the solstice, right? Tuning into public radio, like an experience that we've all had, right? When you're driving, and then that day, that magical sort of day in which you feel like there's something supernatural going on in the natural world. And then, of course, this song comes on, and then to conclude it with this wonderful image of tasting pewter on the tankard rim.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just so, you know, to go from sight to sound to taste, you know.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And that's what these guys made me think of. You know, there are a million YouTube clips of them, and many of them are in pubs where they're just the three of them stand up with 50 people all sitting around, and they're just in the pub together, and they just stand up and start singing, and somebody captures it. And they have several records, but not as many as they should have had, given how great they were. But when you hear them, you want to quaff a tankard. Maybe Italians don't quaff tankards, but in this case, I do.
Well, when you hear this music, you want to. That's the world that you're in, Kristen. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not a musical expert, but they're singing in harmony, aren't they? And that's so rare in music these days. You know, I mean, the Beach Boys did, you know, the early Beatles did, and it's so beautiful, you know, harmony is so beautiful.
Yeah, it's a great thing, and it's a great thing to do. It's a physically pleasurable feeling that you get when you're singing. I've done a little bit of this. Normally I'm a soloist, but I've done some group singing, and the other tones that harmonize with what you're doing create a kind of an envelope of energy around you that you feel in your body. I mean, you feel it in your bones when it's right, you know, and everything locks in, and you're in tune, you know, you resonate together. And these guys very obviously had that. I mean, they sang together for 30, 40 years. And it is in harmony, but more than that, it's a cappella. So it's pure. It's just the voices.
Yeah.
Of these three men. So anyway, this poem was printed in Literary Imagination a number of years ago. And I always wanted to include a musical clip of those guys. So this is my chance to do. I had to do it. It was my chance to do it. So
great. Thank you.
Yeah.